Now I am presenting before you the fifth video or part 5 of my presentation on the making of a global world. In the textbook, it is the fourth main section, which deals with the rebuilding of a world economy in the post-war era. The Second World War broke out mere 2 decades after the end of the First World War. It was fought between Axis powers, which included Germany, Japan, and Italy, and on the other hand were the Allies, which included Britain, France, and Soviet Union, and the US. After the Second World War, once again, death and destruction was enormous, and in fact, it was at times unbelievable. Almost 3% of the world's 1939 population were believed to have been killed. But there was a change here from the earlier situation, that is, from the First World War. In the Second World War, more civilians than soldiers died from war related causes. Vast parts of Europe and Asia were devastated, and now it also had its impact on the economy of the entire world. The war caused an immense amount of economic devastation and social disruption. In this grim situation, reconstruction seemed to be a long drawn process and, in fact, a very difficult one. But reconstruction had to happen, and the two crucial influences that shaped post war reconstruction were as follows. First, emergence of US as the dominant economic, political and military power in the western world. And second was dominance of Soviet Union, which had transformed itself from a backward agricultural country into a world power, and also because of its huge sacrifices to defeat Nazi Germany. Now the world had two power blocks, the US and the Soviet Union, which were going to dominate the entire world in the next few years. In this subsection, we will deal with the post war settlement and the Bretton Woods institutions. The interwar economic experiences taught two key lessons to the economists and politicians of the entire world. First and foremost, an industrial society based on mass production cannot be sustained without mass consumption. So, whatever was produced actually needed to be consumed equally. Mass consumption could only be ascertained by high and stable income. Stable incomes required full employment because without full employment, stable incomes cannot be ascertained. Here, market alone could not guarantee full employment. Therefore, the role of government becomes important. Government had to minimize fluctuation of prices, output, and they also had to ascertain employment for its population. Second important lesson was that the goal of full employment could only be achieved if governments had power to control flow of goods, capitals, and labor. The basic framework of this economic growth was agreed upon at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. Institutions established by Bretton Woods were also known as Bretton Woods Twins because two main institutions were established. They were International Monetary Fund or the IMF, and the second was World Bank. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, was formed to deal with external surpluses and deficits of its member nations. It came to the aid of its member nations whenever they faced any grim situation. On the other hand, World Bank was set up to finance the post-war reconstruction. The US had an effective right of veto over key decisions of IMF and the World Bank. Here we are going to deal with the early post-war years and the changes that were introduced during this period. The Bretton Woods system proved extremely beneficial for the growth of trade and incomes for both the Western industrial nations as well as for Japan. World trade grew annually at over 8% between 1950 and 1970, and the incomes at nearly 5%. This was a period when trade started stabilizing and even the income started stabilizing. For much of this period, unemployment rate averaged less than 5% in most of the industrial countries of the world. The growth, or the economic growth, as can be said, was almost stable and there was no large fluctuations which could be witnessed. These decades also saw the worldwide spread of technology and enterprise. In this section, we will learn about decolonization and independence and how this affected the global economy in a big manner. When the Second World War ended, large parts of the world were still under European colonial rule. But now the colonies, European powers actually faced pressure from different parts of the world to free these colonies. Over the next 2 decades, most colonies in Asia and Africa emerged as free independent nations, but they were overburdened by poverty and the lack of resources. Now, why they were facing these problems? Mainly because the colonial leaders had exploited their resources and their money, leading to the poverty of the masses. The IMF and the World Bank were designed to meet the financial needs of the industrial countries. But we see that as Europe and Japan were able to reconstruct their economies and they were able to make a fast growth, they grew less and less dependent on the IMF and the World Bank. So, now what was the role of the IMF and the World Bank? From the late 1950s, the Bretton Woods institution began to shift their attentions more towards the developing countries because these developing countries needed their aid from the Bretton Woods institutions. Still, most of the developing countries did not actually benefit from the fast growth that the Western economies experienced in the 1950s and the 1960s. They almost felt left behind in the race of economic growth. So now they organized themselves for the formation of NIEO. Now, what exactly was the NIEO? It was the new international economic order, which was known in the short form as NIEO. The developing countries therefore organized themselves as a group, and this group was known as Group of 77 or G77, which demanded the NIEO. By this, they wanted a real control over their natural resources, more development assistance, fairer prices of raw materials, and better access for their manufactured goods in the developed countries' markets. This is the last subsection of the topic, and it deals with the end of Bretton Woods and the beginning of the process of globalization. Despite years of stable and rapid growth, not all was well in the post war world. From the 1960s, the rising costs of its overseas involvements weakened US finances and its competitive strength. The US dollar no longer commanded confidence as the world's principal currency. It could not maintain its value in relation to gold. This led to a collapse of the system of fixed exchange rates, and now there was introduction of a system of floating exchange rates. The developing countries were now forced to borrow from Western commercial banks and private lending institutions. This led to lower incomes and increased poverty, especially in Africa and Latin America. We could also see now the rise of countries like China. The new economic policy in China and the collapse of Soviet Union and Soviet-style communism in Eastern Europe brought many countries back into the fold of the world economy. So earlier, the two major countries were leading the world economy, like the US and the Soviet Union, now staged a back seat, and now the smaller countries came to the forefront. How this happened, we will discuss that. Now, in the wages were relatively low in countries like China. This was the main reason why such countries became attractive destinations for investment by MNCs, which were competing to capture the world markets. The relocation of industries to low wage countries stimulated world trade and capital flows. Countries like India, China, and Brazil have undergone rapid economic transformations because of these aspects. With this, I come to the end of my presentation on the chapter The Making of the Global World. This video is also supported by notes, the MCQs, and important question answers on this chapter. Thank you, one and all.